Can everyone hear me clearly at the back? Okay. So I will keep this to about an hour. I was told to keep it to 45 minutes, but it doesn't make sense to travel all the way across country to speak for 45 minutes to all of you. I think you've made me feel far more welcome to this whole day, that I owe you at least an hour of commentary. So let's do that. But I just want to begin by thanking Mahesh and Nihal for bringing me here. Both of these individuals have been a great source of inspiration to me. Mahesh, I knew from his papers at ACSA ever since I was a graduate student. Noticed many of the panels that he proposed, always caught my eye. So yesterday when he picked me up, the first thing I reminded him is I knew who he was just through his intellectual efforts. And then Nihal, of course, has been an intellectual hero personally. And in many ways, what I'm going to talk about today, I owe to him and many other people who set me on this trajectory of working with Asian cities. Which is a good segue for me to get into what I'm going to talk about. When I came to the US in '96 as a graduate student, it was a very lonely time because many of us were confused coming from a part of the world that couldn't be more different than what we find here in terms of how governance works, administration works, how things are run as a profession. And as we were young students trying to grapple with what our professions would mean, both as planners or architects, we struggled with the idea of what or how much it would take us to bring the other side of the world into the picture, into mainstream dialogues. And particularly for me, as I looked around, I had to really seek scholars who in '96 or '97 were doing significant work on Asian cities or cities in other parts of the world. It was a very interesting time because the Clinton administration was just on the rise, the economy was about rising again, and most of the commentary was centered largely on European and American ideas. And it's a good preface because over the last 20 years, I have seen this shift take place both globally, geopolitically, with Asia coming back to the forefront, as well as academics now getting into the style of vogue that I'm doing a lot of work on Asian cities. It's become kind of a cliche for everyone to go back to Asia. And it is at this time that I want to think of people like Nihal and many of my other friends who were talking about these topics way before it became a vogue to be that way. And so I want to talk today about 3 books, particularly my engagement with Asian cities, because what it did for me is really compelled me to think of what urbanism means. And this is the meta-argument I want to put forth. When I came to the US, we all believed that urban practice means a particular thing. It's about having an office, running, having meetings, getting projects entitled, running a staff, so on and so forth. And then we knew kind of this other agenda that was being proposed by academics particularly, that there are alternative ways of practicing. But it was still used as an alternative. It was still considered to be the other bank. And this is what I want to debunk, particularly through my engagements, where we were just talking about this today morning. The notion of urban practice is diverse and multifaceted. And we can practice as academics, if we know how to do so. We can practice as activists. We can practice as urbanists. We can practice as architects, designers, social entrepreneurs. At the end of the day, we're creating a bunch of strategies which are always incomplete in some way or the other. So this is the first book, and it gives me enormous pride, and I want to say this for the record, that Nihal and I exchanged books today morning. This is Nihal's book, this is my book. They're both on Asian cities. They both deal with Asian cities differently. But they were published by the same publisher and actually released in the same week, and they are often being bought on Amazon together. So it was a personal honor to be in the company of a very distinguished thinker. But I want to talk about what compelled me to do this book and why we did it and how. There is no book, at least before these 2 came out, in my opinion, that really tried to capture the complexity of the Asian landscape in a broad, all-encompassing way. It's a very difficult subject. I mean, where do you begin? Where do you end? What thread do you use? The very term Asia itself is loose. It's a camouflaged entity. Nobody knows where its political boundaries are. It keeps shifting. So when you use the word Asian in an academic context, it's very flawed. I get that. But at the same time, we need to understand that practicing in Asia means something different because the kind of cities we have are very different in the first place. So as we talked about how to dissect a book like this and why to make a book like this, it occurred to me about 5.5 years ago that there is, for a lot of students, a lot of lay people, there is sort of this attitude of trying to understand Asia from a reductivist standpoint. I mean, we very easily think of Asia as immediately southeast, Middle East, Far East, North. And while where that comes from is this sort of focused attention on regional identities. You know, you have the tiger economy, so that's one thing. And then you have the Middle East, which is itself a biased word from the British standpoint because it comes from relative to the Greenwich Meridian line. So everything is sort of siloed. And we look at these and we get deep into them, particularly academics. And we sink our teeth into saying, this is Middle Eastern culture, this is Southeastern culture. But if you look a little more sort of broadly, you recognize that if you look at the landscape of Asia, it's been actually a mishmash of all kinds of phenomenologies. When you think of India, I cannot think of India without its influence from the Persian Gulf. I cannot think of China without the Buddhist thread that connected India and China. So what we landed up doing, as we said, if you want to present Asia in a sort of an all-encompassing way, maybe one way of doing it is to identify the broad overlaps that exist and crisscross what Asia means. So if you look at the earliest one landscape, we call these the virgin landscapes of Asia. These are landscapes that still exist. They are landscapes of cities where we have to practice differently. All these landscapes are canvases of practice. This is why I want to bring this up. So we look at a city like Kashi or Varanasi or Damascus, very ancient cities. Their historic cores are poignant with questions. They seem anachronistic. They almost transport you to a medieval time port, which is very different. The way people behave, the cultural expectations are very different than what we or you know or what cities are. So they challenge our preconceptions of what cities are. So there are landscapes of this nature. The second landscape is what we call the intra-continental trajectories. When you look at the Taj Mahal, we see it as an Indian icon. But if you trace its trajectory, it begins with the Gur-Emir in Persia centuries ago. And then through the Silk Route, this trajectory begins to come all the way through to India through numerous transfers and cross-cultural currents and begins to end in a culture which we now know as the Islamic Empire. And this is a poignant slide because it proves to you that the destiny of many of these places itself raises questions on heritage conservation. This is a slide where it shows you that the riverbank, which is on the back of the Taj Mahal, which was originally the foreground of the Taj Mahal, is no longer noticed. There are very few people who go to the Taj Mahal that even recognize that it actually has a river behind it. And so in the book, we call it a paradise trapped between two worlds, a dilapidated river and a slum in front of it. And while preservationists are focused on the white building, the larger rubric of what these places constitute is often left to chance and accident. And these are the destinies which need alternative ways of thinking than the ones we do here. The third is colonialism. This is the first exchange between West and East. This is the town of Gal in Sri Lanka. When you look at this town from a distance, it looks like a Bastille town in France. But when you look at it closely, it's actually a tropical landscape. Now, colonialism is a very interesting phenomenon. The post-colonial scholars have talked about a lot. If you look at it from one hand, it seems tyrannical. I mean, you have a colonial force that came and imprinted itself into a native landscape. But on the other hand, if you sink your teeth into places like this, you realize that what the colonials actually did is they always used vernacular traditions to build their buildings. They always used technology that is available from there. In that sense, you can argue the colonial project was a symbiotic project. In many ways, what are the destinies of colonial landscapes is a question this book begins to ask. The fourth one is what we call self-imposed westernizations. These are not colonial landscapes. They were never imposed on Asia. They were embraced. What you see to the top left is the first Western place ever designed in Asia. It was designed in Ginza in Japan. The British architect Thomas Waters was brought in, and the traditional 2- and 3-story timber maze of buildings that had been devastated by the earthquake was actually built in a figment of British architecture. And then China at the same time, through Mao Zedong, embraced through the Soviet Union precedent an entirely different way of looking at its cities through zoning and so on. These were embraces that people brought in, countries brought in, cities brought in, entire societies, because they perceived the West to have a rigor and an order that they wanted to be their own. And then you have modernism, which brings in a whole other expectation. 4 years after the British leave, you have Le Corbusier, who is invited to India to design his biggest built project. So in other words, kind of ironic, because the freedom from the Western powers now ushers a whole other invitation to bring the Western forces in back as torchbearers that will give you another kind of future. And with this comes what we call the offsprings of modernism. So as cities begin to develop, as industrialization takes over Asia, there's a whole other scenario that's created which we cannot afford to forget as practice canvas. And that is the disenfranchised landscapes, which begin to raise very perplexing questions about what Asian landscapes truly mean and how cities should be dealt with by the agency of architects and urbanists. And then you have the seventh landscape, which is the landscapes of ethnic communities, rural landscapes that are being obliterated all the way from Shenzhen to Iran. And I'll talk about the Iran project in a minute. These are indigenous villages that are trying to grapple with the onslaught of urbanization. As architects and urbanists, we need a very different attitude to them. We cannot go in and the agency of architect begins to redefine itself. The limits of architecture change as we intervene with landscapes like this. And then you have urban cores all across Asian cities where historic cities have grown, they have sprawled practically, demographics. Cities cannot cope up with water supplies. They have found desperate ways to bring in other infrastructure. But at the same time, the urban core now has two destinies. It is either abandoned or it is taken over. And there are a number of essays in the book that talk about the various destinies urban cores in Asia are now taking, all the way from Damascus to Shahjahanabad in Old Delhi, and what this means of how architects and urbanists can come in and to what degree they can actually even make an effective change. And then you have the ninth landscape, which is the instant city landscape. This is the landscape of rapid urbanization, which distinguishes Asian cities from Western ones simply because, in a broad sense when I say Asian cities, because the pace of urbanization in a place like Beihai or Shanghai has been unthinkable. I mean, the legal process in places like the United States would never allow you for cities and development to happen at a pace like this. So that itself is a phenomenon that begins to question what we as architects do. And then the final one is the emerging landscape, which now gets into issues of pedestrianization, sustainability. In the early 90s, every single project being done in China by a high-profile firm from the United States or Europe had big labels of zero carbonism. Nothing came out of it. Many of these projects never happened. But the fact of the matter is they were important polemics that these countries wanted to bring forth. The slide you see to the bottom, perhaps you know, is Thamestown, one of the 8 towns designed outside Shanghai. And as architects, many of us would cringe because it's a kind of a pastiche, a simulation of Bristol. But the argument this book makes is while you and I as architects might think that this is not the way things should be designed, there are perhaps many other lenses through which we should look at these, populist taste, populist expectations, and perhaps performance standards. In many ways, many of these towns have brought notions of community to China that were not there before in a communist regime. So there are many other lenses through which we can assess these kind of places. And the one you see to the top is a city which is under construction in Abu Dhabi. It is called the Saadiyat Island, designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And the signature of this is you have these 4 gigantic projects jutting out into the ocean by 4 of the greatest, most celebrated architects in the world. And the question the book asks is, while it may be totally okay for cities like Abu Dhabi to present a globalizing image by bringing in international firms, the thing we need to keep in mind is these kind of efforts need to find local efficacy at the same time, which is equally important, if not more important than what it means. So the question was, how do you make a book like this? How do you bring this all together? How do you bring in 20 people to write essays on these various landscapes, and how do you mesh them? So it didn't make any sense for us to make them chronological. It didn't make any sense to be place-based. The only way we thought this would make sense is to go thematic, because these were ideas to provoke practice. So we decided to theme it along 3 meta-arguments. The first one is called traditions. Traditions basically means that there are contexts of design in Asia which challenge the project of modernism. They challenge the modern agenda. You cannot come in as a rational modernist. You cannot come in as an industrial mind and make an intervention and then leave. These places demand other ways of practice, and that is what these essays really talk about. The second one we call tensions. Tensions basically says the colonial project and the modern project basically had one thing in common. They were basically grappling with a collision of indigene versus a foreign power, whether it was the colonials or whether it was the modernists coming in. When Chandigarh was designed, 13 villages were demolished. We never talk about that. We talk a lot about Corbusier's wonderful work, but we never talk about the fact that 13 villages were completely demolished to create this project. And the idea of Chandigarh was thrust upon an infant born-again nation. It was never taken through the litmus test of the native public. When Doxiadis designed Islamabad, it was never really taken through the litmus test of the public. And there has been this constant tension about how these cities were made. So these essays get into what this means. Another very important notion is the idea of democracy. Democracy was never really prevalent in Asia until 1947. Japan became the first industrialized democracy in Asia. And that's something we're going to talk about in a minute. So what that meant was a fascinating thing. And the last one is transformations, because you cannot deny the fact. It would be remiss to talk about practice without accepting the notion that there is a rising middle class, that there are malls that are going to be built, that the airline industry is on the rise, and that Asia is going to have aspirations that it has never seen before from a globalizing sense. So the book sort of captures all this and then makes a meta-argument at the end. Ultimately, what this leaves us with is a question of how do we engage with Asian cities? What are the modes of engagement in a place where governance structures are completely different, where economic polarizations are completely different? And somewhere in this is the narrative of the book. The second book is a book on Hindu temples, and this is a bit of a personal story. So I was born in a Hindu family in India, and as I was growing up, this is the image that remained with me, the image of a religion with 1,000 gods. And then as I grew up and became an architect, my radars changed to notice the formalism of Hindu temples. But I was born in a place called Goa, which was under the Portuguese for about 400 years. So it didn't take too much to understand that a temple in Goa was very different, unlike the prototypical image of a temple in the rest of India. Because this temple in Goa is a cruciform in plan and has a Renaissance cylinder and a lantern at its apse, which means that a new offspring had come in through the hybridity of two cultures, which was fascinating to think about. And then as I sort of went into urbanism and planning, there was another phenomenon that began to fascinate me, which is this one, which was ubiquitous, and I'd seen it since I was a little boy, but I had not understood its significance, which is that in India, there are almost these, everywhere, there are these wayside shrines which come anonymously under trees. They're like, years ago I was presenting this paper at ACSA in Chicago, I think, and Stanley Tigerman, the famous architect, was sitting in the audience. And he came up to me and said, you know, what you just presented, this wayside shrine, is like a pimple on the urban landscape. And I thought that was a brilliant observation, because a pimple never tells you the previous night that I'm going to be seen on your cheek the next morning. It just comes. So a wayside shrine actually arises in the landscape. And it begins to challenge the notions of formal planning and urban design, because it really takes over. And what it does, which is truly what fascinated me, and these are excerpts from the book, is it actually has an indelible influence on the Indian city. It is illegal, it has no zoning, but the fact is, through patronage and through consistent worship, it begins to gel, it begins to grow. So you have a tree has a shrine beneath it, the shrine begins to become a rudimentary structure, the structure begins to attract trading activity, and it eventually becomes a franchise temple, which actually means that the millions of shrines that are in Indian cities are important to the future of the Indian cities. So what we landed up doing was going on this campaign of trying to understand what this means. This is a documentation of a shrine in Delhi, which is a structure that was never designed by any architect. It's a tree with a shack under it with about 10 deities. But it's a microcosm for all the people, particularly the disenfranchised, who work around. It is the hub of their community. And there are many hundreds of shrines of this nature. So what we landed up doing is going to villages in India. This is a village in Goa, which has its own rituals every single time. And every year you have this chariot that they bedeck with flowers and these ritualistic landscapes, which are all managed by the people themselves. There is zero agency of an architect or a planner in this case. And what this boils down to is you have morphologies of entire towns that have now evolved solely for the purpose of worship. And they range from villages, which go from modest hamlets, to entire temple towns that have grown from modest origins. So if you take one of the largest temples, South Indian temples, this is the temple of Tiruvannamalai, or if you take the Meenakshi temple in this diagram, the fact is it did not, although it looks like a built-at-once complex, it's actually not. It actually grew from a tiny little insignia or a little phallic symbol found under a tree, and then through recurrent patronage over centuries, it became the complex we see today, which is a very interesting observation because there's been this millennial pattern of creating an alternative urbanism, which we now think as alternative. And the question the book begins to ask is, how do we bring it into mainstream practice? If we as urbanists are savvy enough to recognize these phenomena, how do we get it into dialogues as we craft instruments to shape cities? So these are all excerpts from analyzing these places. The most beautiful of these, if you haven't seen it, is the town of Srirangam. It's the most complete morphology. It has a temple in the middle surrounded by 4 lobes and 3 lobes outside it, which builds a town. And the entire town is actually devoted to the singular use of worship. There's an entire typology of towns which is sacred in India. And so this is a snapshot of towns and morphologies all the way from a hamlet to the city of Banaras to your left, which is the largest and most complex city of this regard. And that's Banaras. And what this compelled me to do is actually do an experimental project in Banaras, which is the oldest sacred Hindu city in India. What most architects get fascinated by in Banaras is this landscape of the Ghats. The Ghats are steps for about 3 kilometers that go down from the hill to the river Ganga. The Ganga is the sacred river for the Hindus. It is believed that if you bathe in the waters of the Ganga, you are freed of all your sins. So basically, the history of Banaras emerges from this mythic connotation of having a city or a habitat along the banks of the water. But the fact of the matter, and this is what strangely architects do not try to sink their teeth into, I think planners probably do in their own way, I don't know, is the notion that although Banaras is dominated by a sacred landscape, fact of the matter is it is a very ordinary Indian city. It is as ordinary as anything else. It is a city that is struggling with a crippling housing shortage, social oppression, all kinds of issues that typify an Indian city. And basically the argument is this. This is a city where temples have more ubiquity and power than any other city. The reason pilgrims flock to the city in millions every year is because there are temples. They take pilgrimages. This is a sacred city for all practical purposes. But if you look at the zoning instruments that are sustaining the city every day, they're extremely mainstream. You have land use plans. You have entitlement projects. You have a municipal commissioner. You have a centralized government system where the municipal commissioner is the head. So we took 12 students from the Price School as the team, and just want to talk a little bit about the lab structure because this becomes very interesting. So basically, you have to acknowledge the fact that when you go to projects like this, the danger is you can pretend to be someone you're not, and that's not a good thing. Basically, you are a foreigner. You're 50,000 miles away. You know nothing about this city. So you cannot sink your teeth into the deeper issues of what this means. That said, it's very important not to be apologetic about it because foreigners, particularly naive foreigners, myself included, bring a lot of refreshing ideas on a place, which locals many times do not. So what we chose to do in this lab, we had the complete freedom and the funding to do whichever way we want, whichever way to sequence the lab. But what we decided to do is, rather than taking the students in the first 2 weeks of the studio and basically look at Banaras and understand it, we chose to reverse the sequence because for us it didn't make any sense to go there for a month or 2 months, really do analysis that planners do and basically come up with some findings that you could then put interventions in. Let's say we felt it was a very incomplete, immature way to understand the city because you're doing a namesake understanding of what Banaras means. We felt it was far more compelling to actually sit here until the last 2 weeks of the semester, actually analyze everything to the degree we could through a lot of material that we had collected over the summer. And rather than going there to reflect on what the city means, go there to verify our findings with the locals. So what we ended up doing is making propositions in the United States from different points of view, and then going there in the last 2 weeks to meet with everyone from the municipal commissioner to a hermit on the Ghats to an NGO head, a non-government organization head, to ask them whether what we had proposed made any sense. And so the final presentations were not a solution. It was a duality with a red line drawn in the middle of it that's saying the one above the red line was what I did when I was in the US. The one below the red line is what I have transformed, changed, or not as I began to interact and engage with the city. And I think this is a very different way of practice. This is what I want to emphasize again to just reinforce the theme. Because as practitioners, what we are programmed to usually think is the first thing you have to do is understand the site or understand the study area. And I think it is important to remember that many times we will never have the ability to understand the study area. And it is better to acknowledge that and use the instruments that are already in place. And so a lot of solutions essentially came out of this lab, which we are working currently to. Water supply is a huge issue. And so small scale, modest water supply strategies become a big deal, providing people with potable water systems, finding ways of cleaning water in a very, very domestic scale. There's flooding every year. The river floods, actually inundates huge pilgrimage circuits in areas. To find out potential abilities and methods of curbing. The third one was a very radical one. Varanasi is congested, and for the longest time, the city has grown on the western bank, but the eastern bank of the river is not built on because it's considered profane. The sacred side is considered the western side because it rises to the eastern sun. But what surprised us is as we crossed over to the other bank, there was already a lot of informal habitat there. So we might as well make a proposition of building a new city that would decongest Benares. So this is something we're working on right now. There were zoning ideas. This was an interesting one. It was a transfer strategy where if you have the Ghats, which are these beautiful UNESCO World Heritage sites, old houses and palaces that are along the water, where people are constructing things illegally and so on, and the government is shouting at them. And one idea was, obviously, the FAR in these places across India is very, very high. So by law, you are allowed to take the Ghats much higher. And one tool we proposed is, well, what if you actually allow people to take this extra FAR that you have by law and sell it to the outskirts of the city where you want new development to take place. And as a result, the condition is that the money that would then come to you would go into the preservation and the upkeep of this historic district, and so on and so forth. These strategies have been tried. This in fact was based on a project in Mumbai. It was called the zoning transfer strategy, and so on and so forth. The campus, the Banaras Hindu University campus is a beautiful campus, but doesn't connect to the river. What do we do with it? Garbage collection is a big issue. My point is, what we landed up doing essentially was a model of multidisciplinary activity, which today is, I think, known to most academics, but you'd be surprised that it's not in many cases. So the notion of planning is not about high design. It's actually about high activism. It's about finding the conduits through which you will engage with a city like this. I just want to point this out again and emphasize it. The notion of practice begins to change in a project like this because you can never go there as an architect and propose an artifact. You can never go there and propose a bathroom facility necessarily. You can, but I think the effectiveness of that idea would be limited, particularly because you're not going to be there to monitor it. A far more interesting contribution to the government would be to go and propose broad ideas that are often naive and to leave it as a legacy for the governments or the people or the NGOs to take it over, which means that what you can do is, as a planner or as an urbanist or architect, find the conduits that you can engage with in a complex city like this, all the way from a zoning strategy that you will talk to the municipal commissioner about, to a garbage cleaning idea that you would talk to a non-government agency about, to uplifting social oppression by taking care of conduits that are already in place, activists, social workers. The one that I remember the most, which I'm particularly proud of, is we ultimately realized that if there's one single thing I would propose for Banaras today, it would be to decentralize the governance. Because I think that has nothing to do with architecture, but it has everything to do with architecture and the city. Because what's happening right now is there's a single central municipality, and the municipality is responsible for cleaning the entire city. And the city doesn't get clean because you can fill in the blanks. The bottom line is you have all these temples that are mighty corporations. I mean, hundreds and millions of pilgrims come every year, and these corporations have business deals. For example, we found out that the flower sellers who sell flowers to the temple every day actually pay a commission. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the business that's happening outside the temple and the temple activity. Yet if you go to the surroundings of the temple, they're absolutely filthy. So a simple idea could be, if you decentralize the city and you tell many of these temples to become autonomous trusts, where they now have a jurisdiction over a quarter mile or a half mile of their surroundings that they can upkeep. This is a strategy that has been tried in the biggest temple in India, the Tirumala temple, and it's working quite well. And if cities like this begin to decentralize their governance rather than waiting for a single municipality to take it over, I think we can see a lot of change. So what I'm going with this is a form of practice. Practice is about identifying the agencies and the conduits and the scope that particularly we as architects need to engage in. I think it's fallacious. We just had this discussion in the studio today. It's fallacious to think that there are limits to what your profession can do. I think the limits of architecture in these places change. You become more of an activist. And the idea of identifying the means of approaching the cities is in fact the greatest contribution that you can make as a practitioner. And then the third book, Zen Spaces and Neon Places. So I was a national scholar to Japan in 1993 at the age of 19. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at. But I kept going back to Japan for 20 years. And my last trip was in 2013. And this book is essentially a compilation of 20 years of writing on Japan, which is a second home to me. And there are a couple of myths that this book tends to shatter. The meta-argument of the book, which the title suggests, is if I tell many of you to close your eyes right now and talk about the image that comes to your mind when you think of Japanese architecture, I can bet you it's going to be a minimalist tatami room with shoji screens and nothing in it, or a Tadawando building, perhaps, with beautiful concrete. But what if Japanese architecture is actually far more complex? Of course it is. It's more than 1,000 years old, more than that. How could it not be? So why do we have these images of Japan? These are two of the most famous buildings in Japan to the Western world, the Ise Shrine and the Katsura Villa. And the problem is a Westerner. So basically, everything you know about Japan in the Western world is a biased, narcissist view of the Westerner. So I call, there's a story in the Indian fables of a man who's lying motionless in the road and his face is turned downward. And every passerby who walks makes an opinion of him. So a drunkard passing by says, oh, he's fallen down intoxicated. A thief suspects that this guy is hiding something. And finally, a hermit is passing by. He sees a meditating saint and he bows down in reverence. So the bottom line is, every person sees in the entity a bit of themselves. And so Charles Moore, the famous architect in America, went to Japan and wrote a beautiful essay. In that essay he said, Japan has been the dark waters in which Narcissus saw himself. And I couldn't agree more. So it's the first line of the book. I think the idea of Japanese architecture has been completely skewed. And we don't know anything about Japanese architecture. And the culprit is a German architect by the name of Bruno Todt. Many of you know him. 1933, Bruno Todt went to Japan from the Bauhaus. He had two students who had studied with him from the Bauhaus. He knew nothing about Japanese architecture. The two students took him next day to these two buildings. And this was in 1933 at a time when modernist minimalism, structuralism was really becoming the vogue of the day. So someone like Bruno Todt went and fell in love with these buildings because he felt that it was kind of a confirmation of everything the modernists were trying, rejecting ornament, trying to do all these things. The Japanese had done this ages ago. And so he came back and he wrote a beautiful essay comparing these two buildings as the archetypes for Japan as much as the Parthenon is to Greece. And the fire took over, and both Japanese modern architects as well as Westerners embraced this idea that Japanese architecture is this minimalist aesthetic. The fact is, nothing could be closer, further, this could not be true at all. Nothing could be further than what he said. And so this is the Ise Shrine. The Ise Shrine is the oldest buildings in Japan. But even the Ise Shrine is skewed in the way we understand it. First of all, it's not a shrine. It is 60 structures in two different complexes that are rebuilt every 20 years. I'm sure you know this. Like every structure is taken apart and it's rebuilt meticulously. It's been going on for about, mythically, 3,000 years or so, it is believed. And the last one happened in 2013. And it takes 20 years because that's the amount of time it takes for the trees to grow, and be seasoned in the water, and the hinoki wood to be ready, and so on and so forth. But the book goes behind the scenes and says, well, this is the Ise you and I know. What we don't know about the Ise Shrine is that it's facing a severe problem about its future. Because what has happened is, previously it was a very self-sustaining ecology. You had the shrines, and all the forests where the timber would come for the shrines would be right around them. What has happened today is the soil is contaminated, the wood grows, but the quality of the wood is not good enough for the buildings. And as a result, all the wood has to be shipped from 5,000 miles away. So, $280 million are spent every year to create this ceremony every 20 years, and which is a very precarious future now. I mean, how do you adapt to a crisis where there's no wood to build on? So these are the questions the book seeks to ask. I mean, this is the deeper aspect of what Japanese architecture should be talking about. But when you look at the panorama of Japanese architecture, you find a number of distinct attitudes which have gone undermined. For example, you have the primitivist attitude, which we had talked about in the Ise Shrine. You have a structuralist attitude. I mean, when you look at pagodas, or these gigantic buildings that were raw timber, you have pure structure that is expressed in architecture. You have a pictorial attitude where the torii is absolutely red against a blue background, or gilded. You have an eclectic attitude in the kabuki theaters, and so on and so forth. And you have a minimalist attitude which occurs through the advent of Zen. So the chapters seek to keep breaking myths about Japanese architecture the way I've sought to realize it. For example, Arthur Drexler wrote one of the first important books on Japan in 1955. And there was a very peculiar mention that stayed with me. He said, Japanese rooms are like Mondrian compositions. And if you look at it, it's quite true. I mean, if you know the work of Pierre Mondrian, the Deschtil painter, you look at the sort of frontal perception of Japanese room, it reminds you of Mondrianesque attitudes. And so there's a chapter in the book that actually dissects this idea. And while there is no direct connection between Mondrian and Japanese rooms, you can begin to argue that there is the Buddhist notion of reality is what you make of it, and there is Pierre Mondrian's own writings on Dutch Calvinism where he talks about rejecting the object. So there are a lot of analogies, but the fact of the matter is you have this unique notion of perceiving reality which is not through the way Westerners perceive it. In our idea, we usually perceive space through length, breadth, height, and volume. We have chairs, we have objects, we walk through them. In a Japanese room, there's absolutely nothing, particularly the Zen rooms. So you basically sit in front of a wall, and if you meditate on the wall, you realize that every wall actually has a different composition, consciously. They never were combined. You never have a continuing lintel or anything of that nature. They always, so the book sort of sinks its teeth into what that means. This is a slide I show my students all the time. We all know the Noli plan. It was done in 1748 by Jean Battista Noli. It took him 20 years to do this. And it was a brilliant remapping of Renaissance Rome, where he sort of negates history. He takes ancient Rome, medieval Rome, the Christian Rome, Renaissance Rome, and just puts it as one gray matrix. He doesn't separate. He doesn't create a history of choice. And then he prioritizes public space, publicness by showing you interior space. You know what the Noli plan is. At the exact same time, there was a mapping going on in the city of Kyoto, which was called the Rakuchu Rakugai, which was a very different way of mapping a city. If you look at these two priorities, you recognize how mappings have been very different in cultures. So for example, this is not about morphological precision. This is about impressionistic capturing of events in time. If this is the city as an artifact, this is the city as an event in flux, constant flux. The book gets into modern interpretations, the diffusion of East-West in Japan. There's been a century of amazing exchange between Japan and the West, all the way from Gamble House in Los Angeles, which was designed by the Greens, where they were vocal about their influence, Japanese architecture influencing them, and then Rudolf Schindler, one of the most beautiful houses in Los Angeles, the Kings Road House, which remained scandalized and quiet for a number of years until the 1970s when it was resurrected. Very Japanese in space. So the book takes you through this century of encounters between Japan and the West and what spatial paradigms it produced. Which brings me to the city that I've often said in interviews is a city that I would return to again and again to find answers. Because Tokyo, for me, remains the most enigmatic and perplexing city in the world. If you map the evolution of a city anywhere in the world, you will get a black figure that keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. If you map Tokyo in that way, you will get this diagram. And what happens is you start as a tiny castle town, and then the city grows, and all of a sudden something happens, and there's a big gray area. And then it gets filled in again, and it grows. And then all of a sudden there's another big gray area. And then it grows again, it grows again. And what these gray areas are, of course, what we call disasters. The massive earthquake or the tsunamis that have destroyed, or wars that have destroyed massive portions of the city. And so the question I ask is, how would you live in a city that you know will be destroyed from time to time? It's something quite unthinkable for many of us. The second issue Tokyo faces is land scarcity. As we all know, Tokyo is very mountainous. So if London has 30% park space, Tokyo has 5%. So it's an incredible paradox of what cities are and how they're made. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when Western architects particularly go to Tokyo, Tokyo has been written about more by Western architects than any other city in the world. They come back with a number of reactions. I mean, Tokyo has been described as a horrendous city. Tokyo has been described as a perplexing city. Tokyo has been described as a city based on pornography. I mean, everything in the world. I mean, people, it's a narcissistic attitude. You see what you want in Tokyo. But one thing that has remained consistent in the criticism of the Western architects looking at Tokyo is the chaos, particularly a cursory look at Tokyo, is the chaotic urban form of Tokyo. It doesn't have the kind of regulated urban formality that many cities have, which is something we find in many Asian cities as well. And this is where you begin to ask, you have to dig into the history of a city. If you dig into how Tokyo evolved, modern day Tokyo evolved, you recognize that circa 1947, Tokyo is under the American occupation, becomes insinuated with the first Western democracy project in Asia, and then 50% of Tokyo is lying completely devastated to the ground. So the government has this incredible challenge of rebuilding this city. And so what it does is, although it has all these plans to resurrect the city through master planning and so on, it doesn't have the time to do so. So what the government of Tokyo did is it actually said, we will build all the infrastructure, but we will not give you rigid zoning. And the result is every single parcel of land that was owned was built by the people themselves in a manner to rebuild the city. So when you look at Tokyo from a formal standpoint, it hardly has the clarity that a Western city has. But when you look at Tokyo as an experience, every idea we promote here, walkability, mixed use, efficiency, mass transit, is something that we can learn from Tokyo. So the book calls for a shift again in perceptions. We reprogram ourselves to trying to say, instead of going to a city with preconceived notions of what ideal cities ought to be, if we go to a city and try to examine it on their own terms, a call for a kind of an empathetic attitude. It's easy for me to say, I don't like you because you're not like me or you don't agree with me. There's a difference. It's a bigger attitude to say, I'll sit with you and I'll try and listen to where you're coming from. And then I'll try and make an engagement with you. So the pitch of the book is to say Zen spaces and neon places is a far more inclusive attitude to trying to understand that Japan is a both-and, just like any other culture. Every culture is eventually a both-and phenomenon. So this is a documentation we did on the lot widths of Tokyo. Because land is so scarce, what happens is you can see that the lot widths in many parts of Tokyo, particularly Shinjuku, range anywhere from 8 feet to 20 feet. This would be illegal in the United States, but it works in Japan. So there are many things of this nature that comes apart, and you have buildings that look like this. It's a comparison of density and growth of Los Angeles and Japan and Tokyo. And so I'll leave you with a couple of projects. We're doing on time. Okay. Oh, good. So I'll leave you with a couple of projects. So this is a project, propository project in Iran. I've always been interested in Iranian towns. I was studying Iranian towns for the longest time, and we came across this town called Yazd, which is very well known across the world as a World Heritage Site. It's known as a city of wind towers. And what we discovered is this town, unlike other great towns like Isfahan or Shiraz, was not next to any water body. So it immediately begins to ask a question: how did a town like this sustain itself over hundreds of years before it has now become a city where it gets its water from 5,000 miles away? And we realized that what is so beautiful about this town, it has this subterranean water system called a kanat, Q-A-N-A-T, or a kares, which are found in other parts of the world as well. But it's a beautiful piece of indigenous hydro infrastructure that, you know, is a very precarious thing to build on. Basically, you dig wells 50 meters from each other along a sloping piece of land. The Zagros Mountains that are about 10 kilometers away collect snow in the winters and create an aquifer. And you basically, for hundreds of years, these people, thousands of years, have dug these underground channels that connect the aquifer for 10 kilometers to every house under the historic core of the city. And you have, this is the section we documented, so you basically have the water coming first into the fields, then into the reservoirs, then into the mosques, and finally under every house. And now what's happening today, and these reservoirs are also the hubs of the community. So they basically, there was a system in place where there was a man who would be the torchbearer of these reservoirs. You would give him money, he would open a faucet, and the faucet would bring water into your house. This is how, there's a series of villages centered around these reservoirs, and that's how the town of Yazd worked. But of course, what has happened today is the town has grown. This is the house. You can see the channel coming under the house. Beautiful section, summer rooms and winter rooms. In the hot summers, you would retreat into the basement where the water would come and it would cool you. And so in other words, another way of saying it is the cooling tower is the teleological end of a huge regional infrastructure. And what we'll end up doing as architects is we usually look at the cooling tower, but we miss this entire system that's in place. And the town has grown very big. So until 1970, it was still a sizable town, and then it has just sprawled. And as a result, what has happened is this entire system that's lying underground is vandalized, neglected, and nobody's using it. And so, just to keep the story short, we documented all this. And the proposition, basically, that we are investigating further is the idea that you cannot, I mean, it's one thing to preserve a piece of hydro infrastructure for nostalgic reasons, because you want to preserve it. But the fact of the matter is, it neither supplies the amount of water for a growing city, nor is it predictable, because it relies on an aquifer. So if you don't have water one year, if you don't have enough snow one year, you're not going to get enough water. The city has grown to such a big footprint, what do you do with it? So the proposition was the following. Yazd gets its water currently from the Zayende River, which is miles away, and it has all the conventional infrastructure to bring in the water. So it's doing it the hard way in a desert. What if you can reduce the load of the amount of water that it needs to rely on from the outside? So what the proposition was is to take this dendritic network that is lying below the city and basically transfer it as a grey water system. So basically what you do is you remember that the kanats were a gravity system. So they used to always flow water in only one direction. But if you now motorize them, if you reinvent the kanat through motorized systems, and you connect it to all the major factories and houses and mosques, you can collect all the gray water, not black water, and retransfer it into the anbars. You can actually bring the water back into the reservoirs, reuse the reservoirs as treatment plants, and return the water back to the houses, thereby cutting the load and the amount of water that has to come in from other parts of the world. So it was a very interesting conservation sort of urban design project we're still working with. The problem, of course, is you don't have proper documentation of where these kanats are. That's the biggest issue. We're going to need some very serious technology to investigate what that means. The second issue is, while these kanats are underground, the ownership patterns of land above it can create huge problems. And the third thing is I have colleagues who have done similar work in Aleppo, Syria, for example, where the system exists. What happens many times is you go as an architect or a planner, you make a system, you make an intervention, you train the local staff to work, and then you return back to the United States. And when you go back 2 years later, you see that the entire system has fallen apart because people have taken over, or there are communal fights or all kinds of things. My point is that it is not enough for architects to talk about propositions. I think the real challenge for architects is to talk about legacies. What effect is this having in the big picture? And then the last project is a project in my practice which we are doing in Kenya. This is a campus. It's Kenya, but I want to talk about Asia. So, and the connection is, this is a campus that we did some time ago for a Islamic sect called the Bohras. The Bohras are a minority Islamic sect with their headquarters in Mumbai. And it's a very hierarchical religious structure with a head that actually is almost considered an embodiment of divinity that actually takes care of the entire community. And they have two jamias, as they are called, one in Surat and one in Karachi, and this was a third one they were proposing in Nairobi. And while I don't want to talk too much about the design, you can ask me questions on it, the main thing I want to talk about is the process, because I want to shift the discussion from talking about architecture or urban design as a noun to talking about architecture and urban design as a verb. This notion of noun and verb is not an original idea. It's actually written about by one of our mutual friends, Asim Inam, a professor at Parsons, came out with a beautiful book called Designing Urban Transformation. You should read this book. It's very nice. It begins to challenge the idea of urban practice by going into these places. And so the argument he makes is there's one definition of architecture and urban design, which is a noun, which is the product, the campus plan, the campus, the building. But there is the other agency of our profession, which is about the verb, which particularly in places like this, which is about trying to find the agents that will enable it. Because many times we leave with a plan and we think our job is done. But finding the agencies of connection are probably far deeper. So the act, the process of engaging with these structures is really what the act of architecture and urbanism can also be. So in this campus, when we started this project, it was a competition. We talked about it being a campus of sorts, which is, dorms of the boys and girls together, a compact footprint. And then we began to engage with the local Bohras in Los Angeles to understand what their faith was about. And we began to realize that this is a community where you have complete gender separation, where you need to have, a central axis, a symbolic axis, where the mosque is right in the middle, an auditorium to the side, a library and a classroom. So these are the three pinnacles of the campus. And then a boys' hostel and a girls' hostel, completely different. The classrooms are completely segregated. My point is not so much on the design. My point is to try and understand the deeper structures of how cultures work and what they mean. Everything from the space to the language of the mosque was conceived in tandem with these people, very sensitive to the language that they want to propose, and so on and so forth. And finally, what you see there is a exam, the final exam hall, where the graduation of a student from this university happens through a review, where the elders actually ask them questions about the scriptures and so on and so forth. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts just to talk about rethinking Asian urbanism. And if you have time, we'll take questions. So Asian urbanism has very different governance. There are many cities in Asia which are governed from a completely different perspective. In the United States, the reason we have the luxury of going into a city and changing its zoning to not have sprawl is because zoning rules in the United States. 90% of cities in the US are made through zoning, whether you like it or not. We can engage in all kinds of academic discussions about tactics, but the fact is your cities are made by and large by developers. They are. And changing zoning to create buildings that are friendly to streets and so on and so forth is a legal instrument that has a lot of efficacy in the United States because it's a legally rigorous system to begin with. You have a lot of transparency. So attacking zoning makes a lot of sense in the US. The question is when you go to other places, what do you do? So for example, if you go to the Arab region, it's basically a monarchy. You basically have a sheikh. Yes, you do have zoning. Riyadh right now is doing a huge extension plan. But the fundamental decisions at the end are accounted by the one who's sitting right on top. What I'm saying is this is not a criticism. This is an observation. The reason being, as a practitioner, as a mainstream planner and practitioner in the US, the frustration we have many times is while the US is an amazingly regulated system, everything takes a lot of time. Everything by default. Because even if I want to do a 20-unit project, I have to go through an environmental impact study, I have to have community meetings, so on and so forth, which is a good thing. But at the end of the day, it takes me an enormous amount of time to get something off the ground because of the procedures that are in place. You go to the Middle East, you go to other parts of the world, you can do this faster. My point is that a good idea can happen a lot faster in many other parts of the world. And that is an important thing to keep in mind from the point of view of practice, of engaging. The Bird's Nest Stadium by Herzog de Murat was designed in China during the Olympics. The ground broke some 8 months after the design had been finished. The construction documents were going on, but very quickly the ground broke. If this was the United States, it would be illegal to break ground before you receive the architectural permits. So my point is there are very different ways in which other cities work, and these are things, these are strategies that we can engage with to bring effective change in a very big way. The second notion is rapid population and land scarcity. There are many Asian cities look like this. This is Tokyo. This is the stereotypical image of an Asian city for many. And while you and I may look at it as morphological chaos, the fact is there are many other lenses through which we can look at this. Land scarcity is a very big issue. Zoning and the lack of transparency of a regulation is a very big issue. So how you engage and to what degree you engage with places like Tokyo begins to forge a very important discussion of our priorities of how cities are. The third one is extreme polarizations. We had this beautiful discussion in the studio today. The guys are designing a toilet in a slum in Dharavi. And that's nice, it's lovely, it's a very challenging project. One of the discussions we brought about is when you talk about extreme polarizations, the agency of an architect begins to diminish every single time. So you cannot go there as an architect and do with a capital A high design. The notion completely changes to understanding what these people are about and what they want. Fourth one is religion, dominance of religion, which is a very important factor. We don't really talk about this as mainstream instruments. Personally, I think it's time to stop thinking of them as alternates and talk about them as mainstream dialogues of what planning means. And then finally, there is a rising middle class, particularly in a place like India and China right now. There is a rising middle class that is not going to stop. You have 20,000 cars coming out on the roads of India every day. There are malls being built. Airports are on the rise. This is a middle class that has lived 3 generations without owning a car. They're an unstoppable force. How you can tap into them and how you can transform them towards making cities better is the question at hand. And then finally, resilience. Asian cities are far more resilient, whether we talk about disasters. In Tokyo, disaster can be argued is kind of a cyclical occurrence. The kind of extreme polarizations you see in Asian cities begin to question many things. So 5 conclusions to leave you with on how we rethink Asian cities. The first one is a counterpoint to our European understandings of planning. So while we in America and Europe think about planning and architecture in one way, Asian cities perhaps give us a counterpoint to think about what that means, expand our knowledge. The second is a look beyond the expertise of state. Typically we rely here on government, but there are hundreds of Asian cities where the performance of the government is not the agent that will bring change. And therefore, what is the role of the architect in this? Becomes a very important question. The third one is urban form is ultimately not the lens of gauging successful cities. Many Asian cities teach us that what you and I think as urban form is one lens perhaps to understand cities, but there are many others. The fourth one is the ideal city. We all have propositions about ideal cities, a sustainable city, a green city, a socially just city. But all these concepts eventually change as they go from place to place, society to society, because cultural expectations are very different. So what that means matters a lot. And then finally, in validation of an idea that urban transformation can in fact be measured through other lenses beyond the analytical ones that you and I are used to. So this is what my rethinking of Asian cities means. I'd love to open this up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Right, phenomenal. That was one tour de force. I think Vinayak has left us with a number of ideas.